The 2026 National Defense Strategy and what does it mean for Korea? We'll also talk about recent events, both on the North Korea and the South Korea side. Up next on The Impossible State.
North Korea is the impossible state. It's a place that stumped leaders and policymakers for more than 3 decades. It has a complex history, and it has become one of the United States' top national security priorities. Each week on this show, we'll talk with the people who know the most about North Korea.
Welcome to another episode of the Impossible State podcast here at CSIS. I'm your host, Victor Cha, President of Geopolitics and Foreign Policy and Career Chair at CSIS and Professor at Georgetown. And today's conversation is on the National Defense Strategy and what it means for Korea. We have 2 wonderful guests with us. Joining us to my immediate left is Adam Farrar. Adam is a non-resident senior associate of the Career Chair here. But more importantly, he is senior geoeconomics analyst for the Asia Pacific for Bloomberg Economics, where he is responsible for research and analysis on geopolitical risk throughout the region. Some of you people inside the Beltway will know Adam more importantly from his work in the U.S. government. He was special advisor to Vice President Harris for issues related to the Indo-Pacific space and intelligence, and then also served on the NSC staff as director for Korea and Mongolia during the Biden and Trump administrations. Also joining us, who happens to be visiting D.C. right now from Dallas, Texas, but a Washington veteran himself, is Igor Khrestin. Igor is senior advisor of global policy at the George W. Bush Institute in Dallas. Prior to joining the Bush Institute, he served as managing director at FGS Global, a public affairs firm. But again, for those of you who are inside the Beltway, you will know Igor and his role as senior advisor to former Senators Cory Gardner and Mark Kirk. And he also served as staff director of the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on East Asia, the Pacific, and International Cybersecurity Policy, where he did a lot of important work on things like the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act of 2018, the North Korea Sanctions and Policy Enhancement Act of 2016, and the Taiwan Allies International Protection and Enhancement Initiative of 2019. And when I first met Igor, when you were working for Senator Gardner. Well, thank you both for joining today on this another bitterly cold day in Washington, D.C., but I think it's going to warm up this week, hopefully. Yeah. And so today we're going to talk about the NDS and what it means for Korea. But before we do that, there were some things that have come up in the news that I thought we could just touch on. Let me start with you, Adam. So there was this news that just came out about how the CEO of Coupang is being subpoenaed by the U.S. Congress to talk about the latest issues between the Korean government and Coupang. Putting your sort of geoeconomics hat on, maybe you could sort of tell us what you think about this whole situation and what it means for the relationship going forward.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, you know, as many folks are tracking, the Coupang situation has evolved out of a tough reality that is Coupang suffered a massive data breach in Korea that exposed the data of almost every Korean, which has led to a series of investigations in the National Assembly and some very combative back and forth with Coupang and a series of executives over the past several months. And, you know, the additional dynamic here is that Coupang, while deriving almost all of its earnings from Korea, is now a U.S.-based company. Right. And so that adds the dynamic on both sides, impacting how they're perceived and seen. And that the problem here is that it's not only about Coupang when it comes to this question of whether Korea is going after a U.S. company unfairly, which is the claim that Coupang is making and the case they're making to U.S. Congress. But also a perception over the last several years that Korea was taking steps in the digital space to unfairly target American companies while advantaging Korean companies. And without taking a position on whether or not that is true, they pointed to several things. One was this issue of network usage fees, the idea of having content providers pay network providers for bandwidth, particularly impacting, not surprisingly, companies like Netflix or YouTube. And then an issue related to the Apple and Google Play Store, their app environments, app stores, and how payments are done. And then lastly, this question of data localization and whether companies like Google Maps can actually provide mapping services in Korea because of national security restrictions that exist. And so within that dynamic, this Coupang situation has emerged, a very real crisis for Coupang given this massive data breach, but the Coupang has seemingly effectively turned into a geopolitical issue between the United States and Korea, putting Korea at some substantial risk if the United States and the Trump administration decide that Korea is unfairly targeting these companies and that they're going to take action potentially in the trade and tariff space to raise that cost. And so this hearing that's set to go forward on the Hill poses a lot of risk for Seoul because it has the potential to elevate the issue more broadly, but also bring Congress into the mix that could, lead the president to take actions that disrupt the trade agreement. And we've already seen the president's willingness to do that, right? Just because his perception that the trade agreement wasn't being implemented as fast, right? This elevation of tariffs to 25%, which has not actually gone into effect, but his willingness to use that threat.
So this issue, as you know well, has always been an issue between the U.S. and Korea for some time, but this Coupang case has really sort of put it at a high level, and has caught the attention of the president, who, as you said, is not unwilling to use tariff tools willy-nilly to make points that he wants to make about protecting U.S. businesses, so on and so forth. So there's a lot to watch here going forward. And see if it really does disrupt the relationship. But as you said, this is something that they tried to address some of it in the joint fact sheet, but still there's a great deal of uncertainty going forward. So something to watch. Thanks, Adam. The other thing that came up in the news this week was a decision by the United Nations, Igor, to allow for humanitarian exemption in terms of the sanctions now, the sanctions regime that currently exists on North Korea, to allow for a humanitarian exemption for NGOs and others to provide support to North Korea. There's probably nobody who has been more deeply involved in North Korea's sanctions policy than you. You wrote an excellent op-ed in The Hill about Congress and the need to, the title is 10 Years On, Congress Must Reclaim Its North Korea Strategy. I'm talking in particular about sanctions. But on the first part of this, maybe you could say a little bit about what does this mean, like for our listeners and viewers, what does it mean when they say, oh, there's now a humanitarian exception or exemption in the UN sanctions regime?
Sure. Well, Victor, thank you for having me on. And I'll start by noting that it was 80 degrees in Texas yesterday. So when I flew in this morning, I was in for quite a shock, but it's always great to be back in D.C. And these issues is a very interesting, I'll say, decision because the sanctions regime is, for lack of a better word, has collapsed on North Korea. The humanitarian exemptions have always been a part of the debate because I think there's broad agreement among the partners and also on Capitol Hill and various administrations that we should be, to the extent possible, we should help the North Korean people without helping the North Korean government. And so the humanitarian exemptions are a part of that to figure out which of the NGOs are able to do so effectively without triggering other restrictions on helping North Korea's military and missile programs. So it's an interesting decision. We'll see what the response is going to be from the Kim regime, from the North Korean government. But in principle, we shouldn't really have objections to helping the North Korean people, especially with the economic situation still being very challenging post-COVID, especially. So, and then with the op-ed you mentioned, co-authored that with Michael Schiffer, who was working on the Democratic side, and happy to talk more about that. But I think there's an opportunity for Congress to look at this piece of legislation, but also do new things that can incentivize the administration to have a more robust policy.
So let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, the point is well taken that, throughout, whenever these sanctions were put in place, the idea was that they were supposed to go after the government and the proliferators and the human rights violators, but not the people, right? And so food, medicine, these sorts of things, there used to be an exemption for that. That went away for a while, and now they appear to be opening that up again. But maybe you could talk a little bit more about what role do you think Congress certainly has played a role in this, and what role you think they should be playing going forward?
Well, I think the congressional prerogatives are twofold. Congress controls the power of the purse, so it has the ability to influence foreign policy that way. It has, especially the Senate, has the power to use nominations for strategic leverage, and then, of course, Congress drafts laws, and sanctions have been the go-to tool for a number of years to try to move, let's say, challenging geopolitical issues on Iran, North Korea, of course, more recently Russia with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and how to use various economics tools, incentives, penalties through various agencies, and frankly, the use of the U.S. economy as a tool to influence partners of these rogue regimes to sort of give up. And so the North Korea Sanctions Policy Enhancement Act came at a time, of course, right after the fourth nuclear test, and sought to do all of these things and use as various points of leverage within our financial system to go after various individuals or entities who are helping the Kim regime, and also use secondary sanction tools, which it's sort of in DC speak, to go after the people who are helping the bad guys, whether it be Chinese or Russian sort of entities. And so it was a comprehensive effort with of course these sort of carve-outs, again, for legitimate humanitarian work that could help North Korean people without helping the government. And it had some novel elements, like including a cyber element, which hadn't happened before. And I think a lot of that was because of the infamous Sony hack, but also North Korea was starting to use the various sort of cyber tools to gain sort of currency and so forth. So this was a comprehensive effort that, as the op-ed note, passed with, I think, 2 dissensions in the House, unanimously in the Senate, 2 dissensions in the House, and was signed by, so that those were held by Republicans at a time, one for which I worked for, and was signed by President Barack Obama. How often does that happen nowadays, where you have unanimous agreement? But they weren't meant to be a panacea, sanctions by themselves. They were meant to be a part of a broader strategy of deterrence, working with allies and creative diplomacy to get the ultimate goal, which is, again, also enshrined into law, which is CVIT, right? Complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization. So that was another achievement, is to enshrine that language into law. So that would be the guidepost. And we've seen us moving away from that, and I'm sure we'll talk about those issues have been deprioritized, the denuclearization part of this equation. So, and then the story since then has been that various administrations looked at these tools for periods of time to ramp up and to sort of use some of these designation authorities. And then we saw a pretty sharp drop-off after 2019 because of various, of course, diplomatic efforts that were ongoing. And so it's sort of, for lack of a better word, gone stale. And so this is an opportunity for Congress to pick up on this and work with the administration to use this as part of a toolbox in a vastly changed geopolitical environment, which we also know because, and primarily because of the Ukraine war, but other elements, including here.
Yeah. So let me shift to Adam and ask. That was terrific, Igor. Let me shift to Adam and ask. So Igor mentioned the vastly changed geostrategic environment in which we contemplate sanctions on North Korea. So how has it changed, and how effective can we be with sanctions, given this new environment?
So we have all seen this massive shift in the original primary location and locus of sanctions enforcement, which was the UN and the UN Security Council in particular, right? Through parts of the Biden administration, there was still this idea that we could, despite ongoing competition with China and disagreements with Russia, and obviously massive disagreements about its invasion of Ukraine, find ways to cooperate on North Korea. But we saw with the first use of veto to stop a sanctions resolution on North Korea, and then eventually now the persistent use of vetoes to end the panel of experts, to basically close the North Korea sanctions issue from the United Nations Security Council docket, that is no longer an avenue for effective sanctions work. And with that taken off the table, as we just heard, the sanctions regime has started to crumble. And so, certainly there's still difficult for North Korea to use traditional trade mechanisms to move its goods and gain foreign currency. But with China and Russia not fully enforcing, or in some cases not enforcing at all, sanctions, the regime is under real threat. At the same time, right, the administration under President Trump are probably interested in leveraging what remains of it for some sort of negotiated deal. Obviously, we haven't seen any major movements on North Korea, and I know we'll talk a little bit about the NDS or the NSS for that matter, National Security Strategy. We don't see any laid out strategy or plan for North Korea, but we know the president remains focused on the issue and certainly has key staff who understand the issue well. So right now, it seems that there's the G7 plus, a grouping of countries, the G7 and like-minded partners that are still trying to hold sanctions together and enforce some of the maritime sanctions in particular. But we're fighting an uphill battle, particularly with Russia's support of the regime in Pyongyang these days. So I think that does two things. One, it emboldens North Korea. It gives Kim Jong-un additional access to foreign reserves and income, and simultaneously lowers the leverage in negotiations that might go forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think the last set of trade figures I saw said that China's bilateral trade with North Korea was much higher than pre-pandemic levels now. So going back to your op-ed, Igor, one of the things so we know Russia has broken the UN sanctions regime. It killed the panel of experts. China's trade is now through the roof with them. But you advocate in particular for going after some of these Chinese and Russian entities that might be facilitating. Maybe you could say something about that.
Well, sure. Well, the big fish, so to speak, would be Chinese financial institutions and banks. We've been hesitant to do that for a variety of reasons. With the relationship that President Trump is trying to build with Xi Jinping, frankly, I don't necessarily see that being used robustly. But there's the leverage is anybody who's helping North Korea and in some way has does business with the U.S. financial system should be sanctioned under this law. It is mandatory. The debate between Shell and May on the Hill is a very robust one. This has a bunch of shells in it. So the administration is really supposed to be doing these things, providing regular reporting to Congress. While I was still sort of on Capitol Hill, we've tried to incentivize these efforts by actually naming and shaming, as providing sort of follow-on and saying, we have open source reporting. Some of this is not very difficult, and there's many different organizations that do excellent work on this that say, look, here's an entity here in Dandong or whatever, and now, of course, with Russia being sort of part of it, there's probably very robust tracking at the Office of Foreign Assets Control and other entities of the U.S. government, and the intelligence agencies, our intelligence agencies. So this is a question of will. I think we have the information, and we should really be doing these things. And but to Adam's point, I think there may be some thinking that some of this leverage could be useful when necessary to conclude a deal that probably won't necessarily meet the high bar set by this piece of legislation. But these tools exist, and they exist for a reason, and they're also U.S. law. So if we want to be honest about saying that we should enforce U.S. law, Congress should really be banging this drum very loudly. And those who care about these issues, there's plenty of champions on the Hill and folks who understand these issues very well. Just name drop Senator Sullivan, for instance, folks who worked on these issues for a number of years, who could really take this and hopefully are taking this behind closed doors and in open settings and saying this could be useful. And with Russia's role now, there's probably elements here that are touching directly, on sensitive areas of development of various strategic systems and the nuclear program that are probably more so call for sanctioning of various Russian entities to the extent possible. And so again, there's no better time than now to look at this piece of legislation to do. There have been some follow-up efforts like CATSA, for instance, is another bill that came after that. It's the willingness to use them and the willingness to make these sort of designations regular, robust, and again paired, which I think is the important point that this op-ed makes. Sanctions themselves are not going to be a panacea to this. They haven't been. I think we've seen, frankly, a test case of this after COVID that, they shut their own economy down basically from the outside world, and the regime is still here. Some could argue that it's stronger than ever. But this law exists, and it should be used and built on.
I mean, you think certainly President Trump has the picture with China is much more complex when we talk about sanctions, secondary sanctioning, when it comes to China for President Trump, given the upcoming summit. But this would seem like it would be a no-brainer with regard to secondary sanction on Russian institutions. There was another report that said Russian tourism is way up with North Korea right now, and you would think that this would be one area where whether it's for leverage or for just complying with the law, that there would be that would be less complex an issue for the White House. But we'll have to see. Okay, let's shift to the NDS, what we were supposed to talk about today. And today we're going to focus in particular on your folks' interpretation of what it means for Korea. We did another show, cross-advertising, with our other program, The Capital Cable, hosted by Mark Lippert, where they did a broader look at the NDS and Indo-Pacific. But let me ask both of you a couple of things that came out of the NDS and what you think it means, particularly for the alliance. So the NDS, they say that U.S. allies, it says that U.S. allies must take primary responsibility for regional threats, with the United States providing only critical but limited support. That sort of phrasing is not with regard to Korea per se, it's to allies more broadly. But what do you think that means for the Korea relationship, Adam?
So on the surface, I think we have to be careful not to over-torque too much on emphasizing this one document as the end-all be-all of Trump administration policy, with a clear eye to the fact that more so than almost any administration, prognostications about what comes next are wrought with difficulty because of the president's control of these decisions in a final say, and the fact that he has pivoted completely 180 degrees on several occasions on different issues. So, something being included, not included, prioritized, not prioritized, in and of itself shouldn't be taken as gospel about what we're going to see over the next several years. Mm-hmm. That said, it was a particularly stark and clear layout of what we have been hearing from different personalities within the administration since the beginning about shifting the conversation on alliances, right? When we look back to Trump's first term in his 2018 NDS, we saw an emphasis on alliances being seen as this kind of asymmetric advantage in the world. And while this document doesn't say, does emphasize some aspects of positivity for alliances, its focus is very squarely through this idea of burden sharing, and South Korea being at the center of that. What's also interesting is it separates Korea and the Korean Peninsula from the Indo-Pacific as it talks about them, seeing almost the Indo-Pacific and the first island chain as a China question separate from the Korea question, and therefore lowering its priority. And along those lines, as you said, I think very clearly saying that the United States is thinking about its force posture on the peninsula, both the numbers and the type of forces that are there, and that if a fight comes, Korea needs to know that they're on the front of it. Now, as I think all of us know, that actually doesn't substantially change the reality, right? This is what's been the case for decades, right? Korea has a preponderance of forces for at least weeks in a conflict. They will continue to have by far the preponderance of forces and be responsible for that ground war. And the United States' value really is in a limited technical manner where it provides capabilities that Korea doesn't indigenously have. And so in that way, it's not a real shift. And I think we've seen from the Korean government a desire to kind of welcome this focus on Korea, a clear articulation of the alliance being something that will remain and is not being abandoned. But it does raise questions about how committed the United States plans to be in this objective long term, and what North Korea thinks of it, and how they read U.S. commitment writ large.
Igor, one of the things that has been echoing around Washington, D.C. lately has been this phrase that Undersecretary Bridge Colby has been using to describe Korea. I think he first said it at the National Day reception that Ambassador Kang hosted. I don't know if you were there. You were there. I couldn't go because we had another event here where he referred to Korea as a model ally. And I think he said it again on his recent trip to Korea. What does that mean to you? What does that sort of phrasing mean to you in terms of how this administration is looking at Korea? Because you have that on the one hand, but then you have like this like beating them over the head with tariffs on the other hand. So your thoughts on that?
Well, I would say it probably has to do with the, I think, 7.5% increase in defense spending in the most recent sort of budget for Korea. So there is an element here about Korea taking on more of the burden sharing, which I think is what this NDS document has been emphasizing with alliances, that while they are preferred, we now prefer allies who are, for lack of a better word, self-sufficient or take care of their own, defense to the extent possible, with the United States as a backstop in what variety of ways. We still have commitments, of course, on the peninsula. So I think that's first and foremost I think maybe the Korean sort of careful reaction about separating the strategic part from the economic part perhaps also played well to the extent that at least that's how I read the sort of not overreaction to this issue of tariffs, which, as you had noted, is a strong preference for the president as a economic and frankly national security tool. And so those perhaps could go into that sort of model ally bucket, as opposed to maybe what could be less model allies. Let's say in Europe, those who don't spend enough on their defense, where the United States it provides a backstop, and the administration does not want to see that. And then again, maybe to juxtapose with the reaction to Taiwan's defense, spending issue, which has been. And so these, and of course, those are very different situations. So I would say so maybe that's the way I would sort of look at that. But then, I would also note maybe just sort of going back to the question of the other part of this is looking at perhaps maybe the role of Russia and what it will do now in this region, given that the relationship, and we were talking a little bit about this with Adam, is probably stronger than it was during the Cold War.
Oh, yeah, I agree.
And so what does that mean for, a commitment? They have, of course, a binding commitment now with Russia for defense. What does that mean for Russia's role? Of course, Russians have their hands full in Ukraine, but they have various capabilities, which they've demonstrated in Ukraine for some very... So that would be another aspect that I'd certainly be interested in sort of looking at and seeing how that would unfold.
Yeah, I want to talk about that in the last block. I want to talk about how North Korea is looking at all this. But before we do that, can I go back to Adam and ask you? So I agree with you. I think that this idea of allies doing more for their own defense, particularly in the case of South Korea. This is language we're hearing in the NDS and from the administration, but there is a lot of continuity in U.S. strategy and policy over the years. It's not that big a shift. And as you said, if a war were to break out on the peninsula, the 28,500 troops there are not going to be the ones that are bearing the brunt of the fight. It's going to be the Koreans. So part of this is about embedding all these changes in a bigger concept of alliance modernization that sort of takes the edge off if we shift, right? If we shift less to a ground presence, more to an air and naval presence, and doing that in a way that doesn't cause the Kospi to tank and capital outflows, like things that you care about now in Bloomberg economics. But let me ask you, as a alliance process guy, when you were on the NSC staff, what do you think that this means for things like OPCON transition and CFC? Like, what do you think going forward? What do you think this means?
So not surprisingly, I think we're all reading this as a green light to the Koreans to move forward on these more nationalist and strategic autonomy derived objectives in terms of the transfer of operational control of forces during war to the Koreans, and part of that, the ownership of a wide variety of mission set within the alliance. And so I think that's part of the reason, we've seen all of this kind of work and together between Korea and the United States, more so than some expected, less friction, is because to some extent it aligns with the objectives of the Democratic Party and President Lee Jae-myung, and particularly the more left elements of his party that have sought to, while not breaking the alliance, and I think that gets overplayed, this idea that the DP is anti-alliance, but rather to find a way towards, that strategic autonomy and it's really modicums of strategic autonomy, right? It's not a break. And so I think the U.S. desire to shift that burden, at the same time you have a government that wants to, from a nationalistic perspective and a sovereign perspective, take ownership of its own defense, I think is, pushing OPCON into a very different realm, right? One where, originally, I think even just a couple of years ago, we saw OPCON as something that we may never see in our lifetime at the rate they were going and the different conditions that were being set forward. And now, increasing likelihood that we could see it in the next several years. And now, there's a broad debate to be had with military experts about what that means for the stability of and capabilities of the ROK military. But I think politically, it's a logical step, right? And one that many Koreans, I think, would accept, assuming that the United States stays involved, right? I think the deep concern, particularly on the right, is that moving to OPCON and doing the transfer means that the United States will back away and actually pull its troops and its responsibility from the Korean Peninsula. And that, to me, is the greatest concern for stability in the region, because it's not, strategic autonomy and growth and capabilities for Korea is beneficial to the United States in many ways. But it comes down to how that integration, how that path goes forward. And if it's done, as you said, in a careful, calibrated manner that keeps people on side and keeps people understanding of where everybody sits in terms of broader commitments on deterrence, instead of kind of a rash break that could lead to economic issues in Korea or broader stability issues.
Right. And that signals also very clearly to North Korea that this is actually an effort that's strengthening combined capabilities on the peninsula, and actually, freeing up is not the right term, but actually giving more capability to the United States to deal with Taiwan, our first island chain contingency, while the peninsula is, stable or remains deterred, is the signal you want to send, not like we're just leaving. That's not the signal you want to send. But in terms of signals in North Korea, Igor, let me ask you, if we widen the lens a little bit. So, we focus here on the Korean Peninsula, but there's a lot going on in the world, right? And so how do we think that North Korea, and this is to both of you, how do we think that North Korea is looking at, what's happening in Venezuela, what potentially could be happening in Iran? How do you think that they're viewing all this with the Trump administration? Does this give them incentive to try to engage with Trump, or does it cause them to sort of go back into their little sort of nuclear cocoon and just focus on that? I don't know, your thoughts.
Well, I would say there is probably, I would venture a robust conversation, given that the regime survival is the paramount goal in North Korea and has been, for over 70 years. But how do we prevent an outcome that took place for Operation Midnight Hammer and the most recent operation in Venezuela, which are really sort of now emerging as kind of preferred tools to at least try to deal with these very thorny national security issues without going into sort of longer conflicts, nation building, and these types of things that this administration is clearly allergic to. So this, I think this is the reason in my mind that that Kim Jong-un seized on the geopolitical opportunity with Russia very fast, with recognizing the regions and really reaching out and offering assistance with the procurement of various material and to try to gauge, to get strategic tools, and assurances that an operation like that, now the time frames here are a little different, but won't take place, in Pyongyang, and there won't be any attempt to use these by the United States. And so that's, to me, is something that I think in Kim Jong-un's mind, he's managed to achieve with these treaties and Russian support and so forth, and the evisceration of sanctions that allows more of an economic sort of freedom. But I think that just, again, zooming out more so about sort of the fractured world in which we live in, I think and I want to be careful here because I believe that the United States is and will remain a superpower, but the future of sort of, of U.S. being everywhere all at once is clearly no longer there. And I think our adversaries know this, and they're trying to hedge, and they're trying to gain advantage. And one of the things that maybe I'll sort of give a shout out to is that, and I know CSIS has done, is this sort of, the concept of CRINC, which is, the China, sort of Russia, Iran, North Korea, which don't have any kind of, a whole lot of sinews, but share a very singular goal of for lack of a word, dethroning the United States and our allies from global primacy. So I think we're in the middle of that period. It's a recombobulation, refiguration, and we're adjusting, and so are our adversaries, and they're trying to gain advantage, with China's support for Russia during the war, with North Korea's realignment with Russia, and how all parties react to that. So I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but I think that's the one I would probably venture.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very real thing. Adam, your thoughts?
I think there's, no doubt that Pyongyang is watching all of this very carefully, and at the very least, the actions in Iran and in Venezuela have reinforced Kim Jong-un's long-held deep understanding that nuclear weapons are essential to his survival and North Korea's future. I don't think he needed more reinforcement, right? Libya, Ukraine, so many examples that he and the propaganda apparatus have already pointed to publicly. So what he may see, though, is trying to take the measure of Trump, right? See who he is in the second term, and clearly a different president in some ways, and recognize that the administration is willing to use force in certain situations. But simultaneously, if he's an astute observer, he also sees that these acts of force and military action are happening in environments that the United States has much more control over the potential risks and repercussions. Certainly in Iran, it was possible that Iran could have taken actions against the shipping of oil through the Gulf, which could have had broader implications, but there was a sense that a very limited strike might constrain them. And so I think he would see himself and North Korea in a different position. At the same time, he is definitely weighing this question of whether to engage with Trump. And, I think all things being equal, I err on the side that we will see some sort of engagement this year, or attempt to at least feel out how much he can get from the administration. But at the same time, as we just went over with Igor, I think he feels incredibly secure, based heavily on his relationship with Russia, and China's desire to kind of keep them and keep in the running as a good partner, given Russia's steps forward in their economic and security relationship. And so he is willing to sit back and wait for an opportunity, and better and understand that he has more things he can bring to the table that risk the U.S. strategic position. And the last thing I would just throw out there is that when we think about this in the context of the NDS and assessing U.S. strategy in the region, we also always have to go back to North Korea's broader objectives of trying to isolate the South and break the alliance. And so they're certainly watching. I think reading what came out, they wouldn't say that probably can't come to a conclusion on what the U.S. is going to do. But if they see divisions start to form, if the digital issue we talked at the beginning actually blows up, those present opportunities to try either through coercion and military, or even openness, to to try and drive a wedge between the two, right? Whether it be just reaching out to Washington and completely excluding Seoul from any sort of engagement, or going down a path that either finds not aligned to their interests. So I think that's what I'm watching out for.
Great. Still greater than 50% chance, right? That they'll meet, right?
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Well, wonderful discussion. We're out of time. Thank you both for joining us. I do want to mention, since Igor is here, that I am also a non-resident senior fellow in human freedom at the Bush Institute. And we didn't have a chance to talk about it today, but President Bush's institute has been continuing to do some wonderful work on human rights more broadly, but also human rights with regard to North Korea. And Igor has been a big part of that too. So maybe that'll be for another episode. We'll get you to come back. Maybe when the weather's a little warmer. Yeah, there's less than 3 foot of ice in the streets of Washington D.C. So again, thanks to both of you for joining us. Thank you to our listeners and viewers for watching another episode of The Impossible State, and we'll see you again soon.